Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we're going to step way, way back in time. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. You're trudging through a muddy cobblestone street, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and a dozen other, less pleasant things. The sun is a pale, hesitant smear in the grey sky, and a chill has settled into your bones. Around you, the medieval city bustles, a chaos of cartwheels, shouting vendors, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Your stomach rumbles. You haven't eaten much all day, maybe a crust of bread and a wedge of dubious cheese. You see it up ahead, the butcher's shop. It's a humble, open-fronted stall, its wooden counter stained dark with the blood of 1,000 animals. From hooks, slabs of meat hang, and you might think to yourself, how is that not crawling with flies and dripping with rot? You're not in a climate-controlled supermarket with a cold case humming reassuringly. This is the real world. A world where a simple stomachache can quickly turn into a trip to the local graveyard. A world where food preservation is not a convenience. It's a life or death science. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In this world, the butcher isn't just a tradesman, he's a chemist, a strategist, and a lifesaver, all rolled into one. He's standing there, his hands raw from the day's work, and he knows that without a refrigerator, his entire livelihood and the health of his customers depends on one thing above all others. He's looking at a barrel, not of water, but of something far more precious, more powerful. It's not silver or gold, but it might as well be. It's salt. You might think of salt as just a cheap shaker on your dinner table, but in the Middle Ages it was a commodity of immense value, a global driver of trade and conflict. This wasn't just about making food taste good. This was about making food last. And you know what they say, necessity is the mother of all invention. But in this case, it was the mother of some seriously intense and dangerous supply chains. The quest for salt shaped entire empires, fueled wars, and determined the fate of cities. Imagine for a moment a Roman soldier being paid his wage in a ration of salt, or a salarium, which is where we get the word salary from, by the way. It was that critical. The butcher knew this instinctively. As soon as the animal was dressed, its meat had to be treated, and fast. The first line of defence was the brine. You see him taking a heavy ceramic crock, or maybe even a hollowed-out log, and filling it with water and an enormous amount of salt. He doesn't have a precise scale, so he uses his hand, his gut, his experience. He's creating a solution so dense that a fresh egg would float in it. This wasn't some casual sprinkle, this was a total submersion. The meat, cut into large, manageable chunks, is plunged into this briny bath. The magic here is the process of osmosis. The high concentration of salt outside the meat draws the moisture out of the meat's cells, and as you probably remember from a science class you slept through, moisture is the playground for all the nasty microbes and bacteria that cause spoilage. Without water, they can't thrive, they can't multiply, they can't turn your dinner into a one-way ticket to the afterlife. But brining was just the first step. For longer-term preservation, especially for things like pork and beef, the butcher would move on to dry salting. He lays out the cuts of meat on a clean surface, a wooden table or a large board. He then takes a handful of coarse greyish salt, not the refined white stuff we're used to, and rubs it vigorously into every crevice, every surface of the meat. He's not being gentle. He's almost massaging it in, making sure no patch is left uncovered. Then he packs the meat in layers, often in a barrel, with more and more salt sprinkled between each layer. This is where the salt really earns its keep. It continues to pull out moisture, and it essentially creates a hostile, uninhabitable environment for spoilage-causing organisms. The meat becomes firm, dense, and will last for months, maybe even a year or more. Historians still argue whether salt's primary role was preservation, or simply to make the meat edible by disguising the taste of mild decay, a subtle but important distinction. Some scholars suggest that a lot of the salt was needed just to mask the off-flavours that would inevitably creep in. This is a topic that can get a bit contentious in academic circles, and it shows just how much we take for granted today. A lot of that historical meat might not have been a delicious, savoury delight, but something you ate because you had to, not because you wanted to. The salt trade itself was a fascinating, quirky tidbit of medieval life. The salt wasn't just coming from the sea. Inland sources, from salt mines, were hugely important. Places like the Polish Wieliczka salt mine, which has been in operation since the 13th century, were like geological gold mines. The salt was mined in huge dark caverns, often by hand, and then hauled to the surface. It was a brutal, dangerous job. But the true danger wasn't just the work, it was the journey. Salt, being so valuable, was a favourite target for bandits and raiders. Salt caravans, long trains of wagons piled high, with barrels and sacks, had to be heavily guarded. They navigated treacherous mountain passes and forded rushing rivers. A butcher in a small town might have had to wait weeks, even months, for a new shipment of salt to arrive. He couldn't just pop down to the local market for a £50 bag. He had to plan ahead, to ration his supply, to be a master of his own inventory. And the quality of the salt mattered too. Sea salt, often harvested by evaporating seawater in large, shallow pools, had a different mineral content than mined salt. Some butchers swore by one type over another, believing it gave the meat a better flavour or a more effective cure. The salt was often impure with traces of clay or other minerals, which sometimes gave the preserved meat a specific regional taste. It was an art, as much as a science, and the most successful butchers were those who had an intuitive feel for the right amount of salt, the right type of salt, and the right timing. They were the ones who could make a side of beef last through the lean winter months, providing food and sustenance when everything else was frozen and barren. So, as you drift off, think about that barrel of salt, not just as a seasoning, but as a lifeline, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of a very hungry, very unforgiving world. As you settle deeper into your pillow, that faint, earthy smell of the butcher's shop starts to change. The sharp, mineral tang of salt is still there, of course. That's the base layer of this whole operation. But now another scent, warmer and more complex, begins to weave its way into the air. It's the scent of smouldering wood, of slow-burning embers, a whisper of a campfire on a damp autumn evening. This is the art of smoking. You can practically feel the gentle heat on your skin as you stand beside the butcher, watching him work his second bit of magic. He's not just seasoning the meat, he's transforming it, sealing its fate in a cocoon of fragrant vapour. This is more than just a technique. It's an ancient ritual, a dance between fire, wood, and flesh that has kept people alive for millennia. Smoking meat, you see, works on a few different principles, and the medieval butcher was an expert in all of them, even if he couldn't articulate the science behind it. The primary effect is dehydration, much like salting. The slow heat from the smokehouse or fire pit gradually pulls moisture from the meat, making it a much less hospitable place for bacteria to set up shop. The heat itself, while not cooking the meat in the traditional sense, is still enough to kill off some of the surface pathogens. But the real star of the show, the true unsung hero of this process, is the smoke itself. Smoke is full of compounds, phenols, carbonyls, and organic acids that act as natural antimicrobials and antioxidants. These compounds not only inhibit the growth of bacteria and fungi, they also prevent the fats in the meat from going rancid, which is another form of spoilage. As the smoke curls around the hanging cuts of meat, these microscopic compounds are being absorbed into the surface, creating a protective barrier, a kind of invisible, edible armour. The butcher isn't just a chef, he's a biological engineer, building a fortress one puff of smoke at a time. The meat he's treating now will last for weeks, even months, provided it's stored correctly. But this wasn't a slapdash job with whatever wood was lying around. Oh no. The type of wood used was a point of pride, a closely guarded secret, and a key factor in the final flavour of the meat. Just as a chef today might choose between different types of salt or oil, the medieval butcher carefully selected his fuel. Oak and hickory were common choices, prized for their strong, robust flavours that could stand up to the richness of pork and beef. Beechwood was also a favourite, as it imparted a clean, slightly nutty flavour. But a true artisan might experiment with fruit woods, apple or cherry for instance, which would give a sweeter, more subtle flavour, perfect for lighter meats or fish. Now, historians still argue whether the flavour or the preservation was the primary goal of smoking. It's a bit of a chicken or the egg situation. Did they discover the preservative properties of smoke while just trying to make their meat taste better? Or was the flavour an unexpected but welcome side effect of a necessary survival technique? Scholars are split, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The flavour was certainly a massive bonus, especially for a palate that might be accustomed to the bland, unseasoned food of the common diet. The smoky flavour would not only improve the taste of the meat, but it could also help to mask any lingering off flavours that might have developed during the curing process. You might be wondering about the smoker itself. It wasn't some fancy stainless steel appliance with digital temperature controls. The most common setup was a smokehouse, a small simple hut made of wood or stone with a fire pit in the middle. The cuts of meat, often pre-salted or brined, were hung from the rafters on hooks or ropes, well away from the direct heat of the fire. The butcher would keep a fire going, a low smouldering burn for days on end. It was a constant, attentive process. Too hot, and you'd cook the meat instead of preserving it. Too cool, and the smoke wouldn't be thick enough to do its job. It was a delicate balance, an intuitive understanding of heat and airflow that could only be learned through long practice and a lot of trial and error, and probably a few ruined batches of meat. A truly quirky and fringe tidbit about this process is the practice of cold smoking. While most smoking was a slow process with a little bit of heat, cold smoking was done in a very low temperature environment, sometimes for weeks at a time. The fire was kept in a separate building or pit, and the smoke was piped in through a long tunnel. This allowed the butcher to cure the meat with the smoke's compounds without adding any heat. The result was a much moister, more tender product, but it was a more complicated and time-consuming process. It was a luxury, a sign of a truly skilled butcher, and the products of cold smoking would have been considered a high-end delicacy. It was the medieval equivalent of artisanal charcuterie. Imagine the butcher, a silhouette against the dim light of his shop, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the embers. He's not just a tradesman, he's a guardian, a custodian of the village's food supply. The work is hard and repetitive, but there's a certain quiet satisfaction to it. He knows that every piece of meat he hangs to smoke, every cut he carefully turns and checks, is a small victory against the ever-present threat of hunger and disease. This is what keeps his family fed, what keeps his neighbours from starving during the long, hard winter. He might even have a special rope, or a particular knot, that he uses only for his smoked meats, a family tradition passed down from his father and his father's father. These small, private details were what made each butcher's work unique. The flavour of his smoked ham might be a little sweeter, or his smoked sausage a little more pungent, and the people of the village would know the difference. They would have their favourite butcher, the one they trusted to provide them with the very best. And in a world without health inspectors or sell-by dates, that trust was everything. The work didn't end when the smoking was done. Once the meat was properly cured, it had to be stored. The butcher would wrap the finished products in cloth or hang them in a cool, dry place. The smoke-cured meat, so dense and dry on the outside, could then be sliced thin, a small piece of sustenance that would last a long time. It was a far cry from the fresh, juicy steak we might grill today, but it was a staple, a lifeline, and a testament to the ingenuity of a people who had to invent every single solution to the problem of survival. So as you start to feel a little drowsy, a bit like that meat in the smokehouse, lulled by the soft hum of the fan, remember the butcher. Remember the quiet art he practiced, the way he turned the threat of rot into a source of sustenance. He wasn't just selling a product, he was selling safety, security, and a little bit of flavour in a world that didn't have much of either. He was a keeper of secrets, a master of fire, and a guardian of the pantry. As the smoky aroma fades and the gentle hum of the fan seems to slow, you find yourself on a different path, one that leads you away from the butcher's dark, smoky shed and out into the open air. This is a journey to a world of sun and wind, where preservation isn't a battle against heat but a harnessing of it. The butcher, your silent guide, leads you to an open-air rack, a simple wooden frame draped with what look like long, thin strips of meat. This is a practice as old as humanity itself, a testament to the idea that sometimes the simplest solution is the most effective. This is the art of drying and curing. This process, you see, is a much less aggressive affair than the deep brining or heavy smoking we've already explored. It's a slow, patient game of chicken with spoilage. The principle, however, is the same. Remove the moisture. We've been over this, but it's the golden rule of medieval food preservation. Microbes need water to live, and without it they simply can't do their dirty work. They shrivel up and die. It's a bit like trying to run a marathon in a desert. Not happening. The butcher would start with the leanest cuts of meat, often from the hind leg of an animal. These cuts, with their lower fat content, were ideal for air drying because fat can go rancid over time, which would spoil the whole operation. He would rub the meat with a generous amount of salt, sometimes mixed with herbs, a process we call dry curing. This isn't the total submersion of a brine. It's a dry application that begins to draw out moisture and act as the first line of defence. The meat is then hung in a cool, well-ventilated space. The location for this was everything. You couldn't just hang a leg of pork in the middle of a hot, humid forest and expect it to work. No, a successful drying operation depended entirely on the right climate. This is why certain regions of Europe became famous for their cured meats. Think of the arid, sun-baked regions of Spain or Italy, where the hot, dry winds were perfect for creating the dense, flavourful hams we still enjoy today. These places had a natural advantage, a kind of built-in infrastructure for preservation. A butcher in a damp, foggy coastal town would have had a much harder time with this particular method. It was a classic example of geography shaping destiny. A historian might argue that this method, while simple in its execution, required a more profound, almost intuitive understanding of the natural world. The butcher had to know his local climate, the prevailing winds, the seasonal humidity. He had to be a weatherman as much as a meat man. He would check on the meat daily, feeling its texture, smelling the air, an almost subconscious calibration that told him whether the process was working. This kind of nuanced knowledge wasn't written down in a book. It was passed from a father to a son, a quiet legacy of observation and patience. A quirky or fringe tidbit of this practice is the role of insects. Now, before you gag, let's be clear. The goal was to keep them away. But in reality, a few determined flies or other crawlies were an unavoidable part of the process. The butcher had to be vigilant, swatting away flies and covering his meat with fine mesh or cloth to protect it. But sometimes a few would get through. This is where things get a bit unappetizing. The presence of certain larvae was so common in some types of cured meat that they were considered a sign of a successful cure, an unappealing but accepted part of the final product. It's the kind of thing that would send a modern health inspector into a full-blown panic attack. But let's get back to the process itself. After the initial salting, the meat was hung. The long, slow exposure to air and sun worked its magic. The moisture evaporated and the salt migrated deeper into the meat, continuing to pull water from the cells. The surface of the meat would form a hard, dark crust, a kind of natural skin that protected the more tender inside. The meat would shrink, sometimes by as much as a third of its original weight. It would become incredibly dense and concentrated with flavour. This is how you got a product like a medieval prosciutto, or a type of salted dried beef that could be carried for months on a journey. The tools for this were wonderfully simple. A sharp knife, a clean surface, and a strong rope were all that was needed. The butcher would cut the meat carefully, often following the grain of the muscle to ensure an even cure. He would then hang the pieces from the rafters of his workshop or from an outside rack, making sure there was plenty of air circulation around each piece. The sun and wind did the rest of the work. This practice also led to the creation of what we might call a butcher's calendar. He knew that certain times of the year were better for this type of preservation than others. The cold, dry air of a winter month would allow for a much slower, more controlled cure than the hot, humid days of summer. So he would plan his slaughtering and curing schedule around the seasons, making sure he had a steady supply of well-preserved meat for the months when fresh food was scarce. We'll get into that more in the next section, so keep that thought in your sleepy mind. The payoff for all this patience was a product that was not only safe to eat, but also incredibly flavourful. The long curing process changed the meat on a molecular level. Proteins would break down, and fats would oxidize in a way that created a complex umami-rich flavour that was far superior to fresh meat. It was the original aged product, a gourmet delicacy born out of necessity. Historians still argue whether the long-term, slow-cured meat was tastier than a heavily salted and smoked piece. Some suggest the drying process allowed for a more subtle and nuanced flavour profile to develop, while others believe the strong flavours of smoke and salt were necessary to mask other imperfections. It's a debate that highlights the different culinary preferences that must have existed even back then. As you lie there, feeling the warmth of your blankets, think about that simplicity. No complex machinery, no electricity, no chemistry labs, just the salt of the earth, the sun in the sky, and the wind in the air. The butcher, a figure of silent strength and a master of his craft, knew how to use these natural forces to create a product that was both a lifesaver and a culinary delight. He was an artist, and his canvas was a slab of meat, his tools were the elements, and his masterpiece was a food that could last through the darkest of times. The air in your imagined world is growing cooler now, and a certain stillness has settled over the land. The sun, which you just imagined drying strips of meat, now feels lower in the sky, its light softer, weaker. This isn't just a change in weather, it's a shift in the entire rhythm of medieval life. You can feel it in the way the villagers move with more purpose, the way the animals seem to sense the coming of something cold and unforgiving. This is the time of the great slaughter. The butcher, with his hands on his hips, looks out over the fields and knows that the time has come to pay the piper. This isn't just about butchery, it's about a deeply ingrained cycle of survival, one that was dictated entirely by the seasons. In our modern world, we get what we want when we want it. Fresh fruit in the winter, a steak from a cow that lived in a perfectly temperate, climate-controlled barn. But in the Middle Ages, the food supply was a giant, fragile clock, and the butcher was its timekeeper. The most efficient and most critical time for slaughtering animals for preservation was in the late autumn, just before the bitter cold of winter set in. The logic behind this was simple but brutal. You couldn't feed all your animals through the winter. Hay and grain were precious resources, painstakingly gathered and stored. Keeping an entire herd of cattle or a flock of sheep alive for months on end was an enormous financial burden. And so, a difficult decision had to be made. A farmer would look at his livestock and choose which ones to keep for breeding and which ones to send to the butcher. The animals that were slaughtered were the ones that would not survive the winter, or the ones that would be a drain on the limited food supply. For the butcher, this was a period of intense, non-stop work. The days were shorter, the cold was setting in, and he had to process an enormous amount of meat in a very short amount of time. He couldn't afford to waste a single scrap. The whole community was counting on him to turn their live animals into a winter's worth of food. He would work from dawn until dusk, his hands moving with a practiced, almost surgical speed. The meat that was processed in these few weeks had to last the entire population through the darkest months of the year, a period often referred to as the killing season, or slaughter season. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely defined the lives of medieval people. Their very survival was tied to this annual event, and because this massive influx of meat all came at once, it forced the butcher to become a master of all the preservation techniques we've been discussing. He would have a whole system in place. The best cuts would be salted and smoked, hung in his smokehouse for a slow cure. Some would be dry cured, hung in the cold, dry air of his larder. The lesser cuts, the organs and the scraps would be made into sausages, or cooked down into pottage and eaten immediately. No part of the animal was wasted, because waste was a luxury no one could afford. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The slaughter of a hog in particular was often a community event. The pig was an especially valuable animal, because its meat could be preserved in so many ways, and its fat could be rendered into lard, a valuable cooking fat and preservative. When a pig was slaughtered, the entire village might gather. It was a time of feasting, of sharing the parts of the animal that couldn't be preserved, and of helping the butcher with the massive job of processing. It was a messy, loud, and probably quite smelly affair, but it was also a moment of shared experience, and a tangible reminder of their dependence on the land and each other. Historians still argue whether the abundance of meat during the slaughtering season led to a brief period of improved nutrition for the average peasant, or if most of the meat was simply salted away for the leaner months. It's a debate that touches on the difficult-to-trace realities of daily life for the vast majority of the population. Was this a time of plenty, or was it simply a time of hard work in preparation for a time of want? The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle, and it likely varied wildly from village to village. Imagine the butcher standing there, the steam of his breath visible in the cold air. He's not just cutting meat, he's managing a massive operation. He has to calculate how much salt he needs, how many barrels, how much space in his smokehouse. He has to plan for every single piece of that animal, from the head to the hooves. The blood could be used for blood sausage, the intestines for sausage casings, the bones for broth and stew. He was the ultimate recycler, a master of a zero-waste economy that we now, in our modern world, are only beginning to appreciate again. This seasonal rhythm wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a matter of life and death. If a harvest was poor, if the grain and hay for the winter were not enough, a farmer would be forced to slaughter more of his animals than he wanted to. This created a surplus of meat that the butcher had to process, but it also meant the farmer had fewer animals left to breed, which would in turn affect the next year's food supply. It was a delicate, interconnected web of cause and effect, and the butcher was right at the centre of it, a crucial node in the community's fight for survival. So as you lie there, feeling cosy and warm, think about that cold, crisp autumn air. Think about the medieval butcher standing over a side of beef, his breath turning to mist. He's a guardian, a provider, a man who lives and dies by the calendar of the seasons. He's the reason that families will have food on their tables come January. He's the one who turns a temporary abundance into a lasting lifeline. As the air grows colder and the butcher's calendar turns toward winter, a new set of smells begins to waft through the air. You can still catch a faint whiff of salt and smoke, but now a more complex, almost exotic bouquet has been added to the mix. It's the sharp scent of cloves, the warm whisper of cinnamon, the pungent aroma of pepper. These aren't local plants. These are the precious imported treasures of a global trade network, and they represent the next layer of the butcher's preservation strategy. As you breathe in, the harsh reality of medieval life feels a little less grim, a bit more flavourful. Spices and herbs, you see, were the butcher's secret weapons. They served a dual purpose, acting as both a preservative and a powerful flavour mask. Let's tackle the preservation aspect first. Many spices contain compounds that have natural antimicrobial properties. Cloves, for example, are rich in eugenol, a compound that is a powerful antiseptic. Cinnamon contains cinnamaldehyde, which has been shown to inhibit bacterial growth. The butcher, of course, didn't know any of these scientific terms. He only knew that when he added certain powders and leaves to his brines and rubs, the meat seemed to last longer, and it didn't get that smell. This is a mainstream historical fact. The spice trade was one of the most profitable and powerful industries of the Middle Ages. Spices were not just a luxury, they were a form of currency. They were a testament to a person's wealth and status. A pound of pepper could be worth more than a man's yearly wage. The great trade routes, from the Silk Road to the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean, were built on the backs of demand for these precious goods. The butcher who could afford to use them was not just a clever tradesman. He was a man with connections, a man who had access to the wider world. He would have a small locked chest, a treasury of his own, where he kept his most valuable spices, a bit of black pepper here, a small pouch of allspice there. But let's get to the second, more cynical purpose of these spices, masking the taste of spoilage. While salting, smoking and drying were effective, they weren't perfect. Meat, especially in a world with no refrigeration, was always in a race against time. Even a well-preserved cut could develop a slight rancidness, a bit of an off flavour that hinted at its age. This is where the spices truly shined. A liberal rub of pepper and cloves could completely overpower these subtle, unpleasant flavours. A stew that was made with meat that was a little bit past its prime could be made not just edible, but palatable, with the addition of a handful of strong-flavoured herbs. Historians still argue whether the primary use of spices was for preservation or to mask spoilage. It's a bit of a touchy subject. Some scholars suggest that a lot of what we think of as classic medieval recipes were simply creative ways to make old food taste okay. Others argue that the antimicrobial properties were more than enough reason to use them, and the flavour was just a bonus. It's a debate that forces you to confront the less glamorous side of history, the side where people had to get creative to avoid a stomach-churning meal. It also adds a layer of quiet sarcasm to a lot of what we might think of as high-class medieval dining. What a delicious banquet, you might say, as the host beams, secretly relieved that you can't taste the faint hint of decay under all that cinnamon and ginger. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the use of local herbs was just as important as the exotic spices. While the spices were for the butcher with means, the herbs were for everyone. Sage, rosemary, thyme. These plants grew wild or were cultivated in small gardens, and they were a crucial part of the butcher's toolkit. They had their own antimicrobial properties, but they also gave the meat a familiar, comforting flavour. A butcher's sausage might be known for its unique blend of local herbs, a recipe passed down through generations. These herbs were the humble, workhorse flavourings, the ones that held the line when the expensive spices were out of reach. The butcher would have a specific process for this. For a fresh cut of meat destined for a quick meal, he might just rub a handful of herbs on it. But for a piece that was to be preserved, he would often grind the spices into a fine powder, or mix them with salt and honey, and rub the mixture deep into the meat. It was an act of faith, a hope that this potent combination of salt, smoke and spice would be enough to keep the meat safe. He wasn't just a butcher. He was a chemist and a chef, all rolled into one. He had to know which flavours would work together, which ones would overpower the meat, and which ones would simply disappear into the background. And the cost! Imagine a butcher saving up for a tiny amount of black pepper. He'd buy it from a merchant who had probably bought it from another merchant and so on, back down the line to a market in India or Indonesia. The spice had travelled for months, if not years, across oceans and continents, through deserts and mountains. It was a journey of immense risk, and every tiny grain of pepper represented that. So when the butcher used it, it was a conscious, deliberate act. He wasn't sprinkling it on a piece of chicken. He was investing in the long-term survival of his food supply. So as you lie there, feeling your own bed warm and safe, think about that scent of cloves and pepper. It's not just a nice smell. It's the scent of global trade, of immense wealth and immense poverty, of a quiet battle against spoilage. It's the scent of a solution and a compromise. It's the aroma of a butcher doing his very best with the limited tools he had to provide for his community. It's the scent of a history that is a little less perfect and a lot more real. As you settle deeper into your dreams, the aromas of salt, smoke and spice begin to meld into a new, more pungent and slightly sour scent. This isn't the smell of decay, but something else entirely, the rich, complex aroma of transformation. You see the butcher now not just as a preserver of meat, but as a cultivator of life. He's working on a long wooden table, kneading a mixture of minced meat, fat and spices. This is the art of fermentation, a process so ancient and so fundamental that it feels less like a technique and more like a collaboration with the microscopic world. Fermentation is the process where microorganisms, like bacteria and yeasts, break down carbohydrates to produce acids and alcohol. It's the same process that gives us things like beer, wine and cheese. But for the medieval butcher, it was the key to creating some of the most durable and flavourful preserved meats, like sausages. The butcher didn't have a degree in microbiology, of course. He didn't know the names of the tiny organisms he was working with, but he knew, with a deep inherited wisdom, that if he took certain steps, the meat would not only last for a long time, but would develop a much more complex and delicious flavour. This is a mainstream historical fact. Fermented sausages, often called dry sausages, were a staple of the medieval diet. The process for making them was a masterpiece of controlled decay. The butcher would take his ground meat and fat and mix it with a precise amount of salt and spices. The salt did its usual job of pulling out moisture and inhibiting the growth of bad bacteria, but the key ingredient was a bit of starter culture, often a small bit of a previous batch of sausage or a bit of whey from cheese making, that contained the right kind of bacteria. These good bacteria, primarily lactic acid bacteria, would get to work. They would feed on the small amounts of sugar in the meat and produce lactic acid. The production of lactic acid is the real magic of this process. It rapidly lowers the pH of the meat, making the environment too acidic for most of the spoilage-causing and harmful bacteria to survive. It's like creating a tiny, self-sustaining acidic fortress inside the sausage casing. As the acid levels rise, the good bacteria themselves eventually stop working, leaving behind a product that is perfectly preserved and incredibly tangy. It's a delicate balance, a race against the clock. The good bacteria have to win before the bad bacteria can take hold. A skilled butcher knew just how much salt and starter to use to ensure a successful fermentation every time. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some parts of Europe, butchers would hang their sausages in places that were known to have a specific kind of microbial terroir, places like caves or cellars that had a unique blend of bacteria and mould floating in the air. These microscopic ecosystems would colonize the surface of the sausages, adding another layer of flavour and protection. The fuzzy white mould you sometimes see on a cured sausage isn't a sign of spoilage. It's a sign of a successful cure. It's a bit like the mould on a fine cheese, and it was a sign of a high-quality product. This reliance on the natural, unseen world of microbes is a testament to the butcher's deep connection to their environment. Historians still argue whether the fermentation process was intentionally understood as a way to create new flavours, or if it was just a happy accident born out of the need for preservation. Some scholars believe that the strong, tangy flavour was a secondary concern to simply not getting sick. Others argue that the rich, complex flavours of things like salami and chorizo were a major reason why the technique was so widely adopted. It's a debate that highlights the difference between a survival mechanism and a culinary art form. Imagine the butcher, his hands covered in a mixture of meat and spices, expertly stuffing the mixture into natural casings, often the cleaned intestines of the very same animal. He would tie off the sausages with a practiced hand, creating a long chain of what would soon become a rich source of protein. He would then hang them in a cool, dark, and well-ventilated space. Over the next few days and weeks, they would transform. They would shrink, their colour would deepen, and they would become firm to the touch. The surface might develop that distinctive white bloom of a beneficial mould. He would check on them daily, a careful watchman over his microbial garden. The tools for this were simple: a sharp knife, a grinder, sometimes a simple hand-cranked one, or just the old-fashioned chop-and-pound method, a good stuffing horn, and the casings themselves. The process was a mix of brute force and refined technique. The butcher had to be strong enough to grind the meat and stuff the casings, but he also had to have the patience to wait for the fermentation to work its magic. He had to be a master of timing, of temperature, and of observation. This method was especially crucial for making use of the less desirable cuts of meat. The odd bits, the trimmings, the fat, all of it could be ground up and transformed into something new, something that would last. This was a zero-waste operation, born out of a world where every scrap of food was a treasure. The butcher was an alchemist, turning what would have been waste into a source of sustenance and a delicious delicacy. So as you drift off, let yourself imagine the quiet hum of that tiny invisible world, the sound of the good bacteria doing their work, turning a slab of meat into something safe, something delicious, something that could last through the darkest months of the year. The butcher, your guide on this journey, is a silent partner to this ancient microscopic process. He's not just a man with a knife, he's a custodian of life, a master of transformation. As the tangy aroma of fermentation subsides, you find yourself in a quieter corner of the butcher's shop where the air smells surprisingly, almost impossibly sweet. It's a scent that might seem out of place in a world of blood and salt, but as you watch the butcher work, you realise that this is just another tool in his vast intuitive arsenal. He's taking a thick golden substance from a wooden bucket, honey. He's not using it to sweeten a dessert, he's using it to preserve meat. This is the unexpected, delightful, and somewhat luxurious art of using honey and sugar. You might be thinking, what? Sugar? On meat? And it's a fair question. We're used to thinking of sugar as a food, a source of energy, but its chemical properties make it an incredibly effective preservative. Much like salt, sugar works by drawing moisture out of food. It creates a hypertonic environment, a kind of high-pressure zone where water is pulled from the cells of both the meat and any unwelcome microbes. Without water, bacteria and moulds simply cannot grow. It's the same principle that keeps jams and jellies from spoiling. This is a mainstream historical fact that often gets overlooked. Honey was a particularly valuable and widely used preservative in the Middle Ages. For one, it was the primary sweetener available, as refined sugar was an even more expensive import. For another, honey has natural antiseptic and antibacterial properties. It contains small amounts of hydrogen peroxide and other compounds that actively fight off microbial growth. So, a butcher using honey wasn't just relying on its high sugar content, he was also benefiting from its inherent, built-in antimicrobial defences. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that this method was often reserved for special occasions or for the highest quality meats. Honey was an expensive commodity. It had to be harvested from beehives, a dangerous and laborious task. So, you wouldn't use it on a tough piece of meat that was destined for a stew. No, you'd use it on something like a fresh cut of venison, or a piece of boar, something that was going to be served at a noble's banquet. The use of honey on meat was a sign of wealth and prestige. It meant that the butcher and the person he was serving had access to the best resources. It was a luxury cure. Historians still argue whether the use of honey and sugar was a direct carryover from earlier civilizations like the Romans or Egyptians, or if it was a rediscovery born of necessity. Some scholars point to ancient texts that describe preserving fruits and meats in honey, suggesting a long unbroken tradition. Others believe that the medieval butcher, observing that honey and sugar didn't spoil, simply applied that same logic to his meat. This debate highlights the continuous, and often cyclical, nature of human innovation and the quiet transfer of knowledge across generations. The process itself was a lot like dry salting, but with a sweeter twist. The butcher would take a cut of meat and rub it thoroughly with a mixture of salt, honey, and sometimes spices like ginger or clove, which complemented the sweetness. He would then let the meat sit in this syrupy rub for a period of time, often a few days. The honey would slowly penetrate the surface, pulling out moisture and imparting a delicate sweetness. The meat would then be hung to dry, often in a cool, well-ventilated larder. Think about the result. A piece of meat that was not just preserved, but infused with a complex sweet and savoury flavour profile. This was the kind of food that would have been served at a feast, a centrepiece that was as much a testament to the cook's skill as it was to the butcher's. It was a far cry from the heavily salted and smoked meats that the common person ate. This was an entirely different class of food. This method was particularly useful for meats that were not as well suited for heavy smoking or salting. Lighter, more delicate meats like poultry or certain types of game could be preserved this way without being completely overwhelmed by a heavy salt or smoke flavour. The honey would create a glaze-like crust on the outside of the meat, protecting it from the elements and from insects. It was a clean, elegant solution to the problem of spoilage. But the use of sugar was not without its own set of challenges. Honey and sugar attract insects, and the butcher had to be vigilant in protecting his precious wares. He would have to keep the meat covered with a fine cloth, or hang it in a secured, screened-off area to prevent flies and other pests from getting to it. It was a constant battle, and a ruined batch of honey-cured meat would have been a devastating financial loss. So, as you lie there, feeling your eyelids grow heavy, think about the butcher's hands, sticky with honey, working a piece of meat. It's an image that defies our modern understanding of how a butcher should operate. He's not just a man of grime and blood. He's a man of sweetness and care. He's an artist, and his palate includes not just the harsh elements of salt and fire, but the sweet, golden goodness of honey. This quiet, often forgotten method of preservation is a testament to the immense creativity and resourcefulness of a people who had to invent every solution to a problem we now solve with a simple flick of a switch. As the sweet scent of honey-cured meat fades, a palpable chill enters your imaginary space. You're no longer in the butcher's workshop with its smells of wood smoke and spice. You're now standing in a cool, damp space, a place of quiet stillness and stone. This is the larder, the root cellar, the ice house, a medieval butcher's version of a refrigerator, a place where he could extend the life of fresh meat for just a little while longer before it had to be salted, smoked or dried. This is where he played for time, and time was the most valuable commodity of all. The principle is simple. Cold slows everything down. It slows down the growth of bacteria, it slows down the rate at which meat breaks down, it slows down the clock. The medieval butcher knew this intuitively. He didn't need a science textbook to tell him that a cool cellar was better for his product than a warm, humid room. He built his shop with this in mind, often digging a cellar or finding a cave or a natural hollow to use as his cold storage. A mainstream historical fact is the widespread use of root cellars and natural caves for food preservation. These were not just for vegetables, they were crucial for meat, dairy, and other perishable goods. A root cellar, dug deep into the ground, would maintain a relatively constant cool temperature year-round, shielded from the heat of summer and the freezing temperatures of winter. It was a simple, elegant solution to a massive problem. The butcher would hang his fresh cuts of meat in this space, often on hooks, making sure there was plenty of air circulation. This was where he could store a side of beef or a leg of pork for a few days, maybe even a week or two, giving him time to sell it before it had to be preserved more permanently. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some parts of Europe, especially in the north, butchers and wealthy nobles would build ice houses. These were structures, often built partially underground, that were insulated with straw and had a deep pit where ice could be stored. In the winter, ice would be harvested from frozen lakes and rivers, cut into massive blocks and hauled to the icehouse. It would be packed with straw and sawdust to insulate it, and if done correctly, it could last well into the summer, providing a source of refrigeration for months on end. Imagine the work involved. The bone-chilling cold of cutting ice in the middle of winter, the physical labour of hauling it, the meticulous process of stacking and insulating it. It was a massive undertaking, and a testament to how valuable a bit of cold was. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of icehouses was for food preservation or for cooling drinks and other luxuries. It's a debate that pits the practical against the opulent. Some scholars believe that the use of ice for food was a necessity, a way to keep meat from spoiling in the summer months. Others argue that it was a status symbol, a way for the wealthy to enjoy a cold beverage on a hot day, and that the food preservation aspect was a secondary benefit. This debate reminds us that even in a world of limited resources, there was still a huge gap between the haves and the have-nots. The butcher's larder, unlike a modern refrigerator, was not just a box that held things, it was a carefully managed ecosystem. The humidity had to be just right, too dry, and the meat would spoil, too wet and mould would grow. The air had to circulate, so he couldn't just pile everything up. He would have to arrange his cuts of meat just so, leaving space between them. He would also have to be vigilant, checking for signs of spoilage, for insects, for anything that might compromise his stock. A good larder was a source of great pride, a sign of a skilled and careful tradesman. Think about the feeling of stepping into that cold, quiet space on a hot summer day. The instant relief from the heat, the smell of damp earth and fresh meat, the quiet order of things. It was a place of rest, a sanctuary for the perishable goods that were so crucial to survival. It was a place where the butcher could breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that his products were safe, at least for a little while longer. It was a small victory against the relentless forces of decay. Of course, the larder could only do so much. The meat in there had a shelf life of days, not months. It was a temporary solution, a stopgap between the slaughter and the long-term preservation methods. It was where the butcher kept his fresh meat, the cuts he was trying to sell that day or the next. It was the first step in a much longer journey, a journey that would eventually lead to the salt barrel, the smokehouse, and the drying rack. So, as you feel yourself growing more and more comfortable, let the peaceful chill of the larder wash over you. Think about the quiet, patient work of the medieval butcher. He wasn't just a tradesman, he was a master of his environment, a man who understood the power of cold, the importance of patience, and the value of a little extra time. He was a guardian of his stock, a protector of the community's food supply, and his larder was his silent, ever-vigilant partner. As the cold, damp air of the larder gives way to the smells of the open market, you feel a new sense of unease. The butcher, your quiet guide, is still there, but now his hands are busy with something other than curing and smoking. He is washing, he is cleaning, he is doing the one thing that, in a world without refrigerators, was the first and most fundamental line of defence against spoilage. He is fighting the invisible enemy. This is the simple but crucial art of medieval hygiene, a practice so primitive by our standards that it's hard to imagine, but so vital that it meant the difference between a safe meal and a deadly one. You see him now standing over a wooden basin scrubbing his hands. He might be using a coarse sand or a handful of wood ash to get the grime off. He doesn't have antibacterial soap or running water. He's using a bucket and a cloth, and he's doing it with a sense of urgency. The butcher knew, even if he couldn't explain why, that the more he washed, the longer his meat would last. A clean surface was a surface with fewer microbes. A clean knife was a knife that didn't transfer bacteria from one piece of meat to the next. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval butchers understood the importance of cleanliness, even without a modern understanding of germs. They knew that a knife that had just cut a sick animal could not be used on a healthy one. They knew that a dirty chopping block was a source of trouble. They would regularly scrape and clean their surfaces, often using a mixture of hot water and salt which served as a simple disinfectant. The very structure of the butcher's shop was often designed for this. The floors might be sloped to allow blood and water to drain away, and the tables and counters would be made of hard, non-porous wood that could be scraped clean. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some places, butchers would use the urine from their own livestock, or even their own, to clean their tools. The ammonia in urine is a powerful cleaning agent, and was used for everything from fulling cloth to cleaning surfaces. While this might sound incredibly gross to us today, it was a perfectly logical and effective solution in a world with no Lysol. It was a resourceful use of a readily available resource, a kind of biological recycling that was common in a world with a zero-waste mentality. Historians still argue whether the butcher's hygiene practices were a result of empirical observation or a matter of tradition and superstition. Some scholars believe that butchers simply noticed that cleaner tools led to longer-lasting meat, and that this knowledge was passed down through generations. Others argue that it was part of a ritualistic cleansing, a kind of protective magic to ward off evil spirits or bad luck. This debate highlights the blurred lines between science, tradition, and belief in the Middle Ages. Imagine the butcher's hands raw and chapped from the cold and the constant washing. His tools, the cleavers, the saws, the hooks, are all carefully cleaned and hung up at the end of the day. The chopping block, a massive slab of wood worn smooth from years of use, is scrubbed clean. The dark stains of 100 animals are testament to its long service. He is a careful, meticulous man, because he knows that one mistake, one unclean tool, could compromise an entire week's work. This attention to hygiene was not just about the meat itself. It was about the butcher's reputation. A butcher who was known to be sloppy or careless would quickly lose his customers. People would go to the butcher with the cleanest shop, the one who took pride in his work because they knew that their health and the health of their families depended on it. In a world where food poisoning could be a death sentence, trust was everything. The butcher's hygiene extended to his own person as well. He might wear a leather apron to protect his clothes and to keep them from getting stained with blood and fat. He might wash his hands dozens of times a day. It was a constant, exhausting battle. He had to be a walking, breathing example of cleanliness in a world that was often very, very dirty. He was a beacon of order in a world of chaos. This whole process reminds you that a lot of what we consider modern innovation is really just the refinement of ancient practices. The medieval butcher knew he had to keep things clean. We just invented the chemicals and the machinery to do it better. He was a scientist without a lab, an innovator without a patent. He was a man who understood, on a gut level, that a bit of care and a lot of elbow grease could change the outcome of a day, a week, a season. So, as you feel yourself getting drowsy, let the image of that simple, clean basin wash over you. Think about the quiet, determined work of the medieval butcher, the way he fought a battle against an enemy he couldn't even see. He was a guardian of his craft, a protector of his community, and a testament to the idea that sometimes the simplest of actions, a bit of soap, a bit of water, can be the most powerful of all. He was a pioneer of cleanliness, and his legacy is a world where we can take safe food for granted. As you leave the now familiar smells of the butcher's shop behind, the world around you expands. The cobblestone streets give way to a muddy, rutted road, and the sounds of the city are replaced by the creak of cartwheels and the distant jingle of harness bells. The butcher, now your guide on a different sort of journey, is not just a stationary vendor but a traveller, a merchant. He is transporting his precious preserved wares, and with every mile you begin to understand that keeping meat from rotting was only half the battle. The other half was getting it from one place to another. In the Middle Ages, long-distance trade was not a matter of a truck or a train. It was a slow, arduous and dangerous process. The preserved meat, the heavily salted hams, the dense sausages, the air-dried beef was designed for this very purpose. It was portable and durable, but even so, the journey was fraught with risks, both from the elements and from other people. The butcher, or the merchant he sold his goods to, had to be a master of logistics, a strategist, and sometimes a fighter. A mainstream historical fact is the vast network of trade routes that crisscrossed medieval Europe, including the famous Hanseatic League, and the less formal but just as vital overland paths. These routes were the arteries of the economy, and preserved food, especially meat, was a major commodity. Salted fish from the North Sea could be traded for spices from the East, and cured hams from Spain could end up on a table in England. The butcher was a crucial link in this chain, a producer who had to prepare his goods for a journey of weeks or months, now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. One of the greatest threats to a merchant travelling with preserved meat was not just spoilage from the elements, but bandits. A large cart full of salted meat was an extremely valuable target. The meat was a kind of concentrated wealth, a form of currency that could be traded and sold. This led to the formation of merchant caravans, groups of traders who would travel together for safety, often with armed guards. The journey itself was a kind of odyssey, a narrative of risk and reward. Imagine a butcher's son, perhaps, on his first trip to a distant market, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement, his life and his family's fortune riding on the creaking wheels of a single cart. Historians still argue whether the demand for preserved meat was driven by the needs of long-distance travellers and armies, or if it was simply a way for a community to have a stable food supply year-round. Some scholars believe that the need to feed large groups of people on the move, from crusaders to travelling merchants, was the primary driver of innovation in preservation techniques. Others argue that the local, seasonal needs of a village were the true foundation of the butcher's art. This debate highlights the different scales of medieval life, from the local to the international, and how they influenced each other. The butcher had to think about every detail of the journey. The meat had to be packed correctly. It might be wrapped in thick cloth, or packed in barrels with more salt or sawdust to protect it. It had to be kept as cool and dry as possible, which was a major challenge in a world without climate control. The carts themselves were often covered with canvas or animal hides to protect the contents from rain and sun. The journey would be slow, the roads would be terrible, and every bump and jolt was a potential source of damage. Think about the sheer weight of what was being transported. A barrel of salted beef was incredibly heavy. The carts would have been pulled by a team of oxen or horses straining with every step. The journey would be punctuated by stops at inns and way stations, places where the merchant could rest and resupply, but also places where he was at his most vulnerable. He would have to guard his goods carefully, always with one eye open. The destination was a bustling market in a large town or a city. This was the payoff for all the hard work and risk. The butcher, or his representative, would set up a stall, and the preserved meat would be sold to other butchers, to merchants, or directly to consumers. The smell of the smoked and salted meat would mix with the other aromas of the market. Fresh bread, roasted nuts, leather and wool. It was a symphony of commerce, a vibrant, loud and chaotic place where fortunes could be made and lost. This whole process reminds you that the medieval butcher was more than just a tradesman. He was a key player in a global economy. He was a link between the rural world of the farm and the urban world of the city. He was a master of his craft, but he also had to be a savvy businessman, a risk-taker, and a planner. His knowledge of how to preserve meat was not just a skill, it was the foundation of an entire industry, a fragile but vital web of trade that held a continent together. So as you feel yourself getting drowsier, let your mind drift with the slow, rhythmic creak of that cart. Picture the long road ahead, the watchful eye of the butcher, and the immense value of the cargo he's carrying. It's a journey of quiet determination and constant vigilance, a testament to the fact that even in a world without modern technology, human ingenuity and a little bit of salt and smoke could conquer the immense challenges of distance and time. As the creaking cart disappears over the horizon, the world shrinks back down to the familiar sights and sounds of the small village. You're back at the butcher's shop, but now you feel a different kind of quiet. This isn't the quiet of cold storage or the bustle of trade, it's the quiet of a craft passed down through generations. The butcher is no longer just a tradesman, but a guardian of family secrets, a repository of a knowledge base that is both a science and an art. This is where he holds the true key to his success, his secret recipes for brines and cures. You watch him now, a man of quiet authority, meticulously mixing a blend of salt, spices, and other ingredients in a large wooden barrel. The proportions are not written down in a book. They are etched into his memory, a legacy from his father and his father's father. This is the heart of his business, the thing that makes his ham different from the butcher in the next village. This is his unique selling proposition, his intellectual property in a world without patents. A mainstream historical fact is that knowledge was often passed down orally, from master to apprentice, or from parent to child. In a world with low literacy rates and a lack of standardized education, this was the primary way that complex skills were transferred. The butcher's recipes were not just a list of ingredients, they were a set of instructions, a feel for the texture, a sense of timing that could only be learned through long years of practice. He knew just how much salt to add, just how long to let the meat cure, and just what combination of herbs would create the perfect flavour profile. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, or fringe, some of these family recipes included unusual ingredients, things that might seem strange or even repulsive to us today. a pinch of ash from a specific type of wood, a handful of a certain type of dirt, or a splash of an aged fermented liquid might have been added for a reason that was both practical and mystical. Perhaps the ash contained a specific mineral that helped with preservation, or maybe it was just a ritual, a piece of tradition that had no real scientific purpose, but was believed to be essential to the final product. It was a blend of folk knowledge, empirical science, and a bit of good old-fashioned superstition. Historians still argue whether the secret recipes were truly effective, or if their effectiveness was a matter of belief and luck. Some scholars suggest that the recipes were fine-tuned over centuries of trial and error and were genuinely effective preservation methods. Others argue that the subtle variations were less about science and more about a desire for a unique product, and that the success or failure of a cure was often more dependent on the quality of the meat and the storage conditions than on the secret ingredients. This debate highlights the difficulty of separating fact from fiction in historical accounts, and reminds us that human innovation is often a blend of both. The butcher's recipes were his most valuable asset. They were the key to his reputation and his livelihood. He would not share them with anyone outside of his family or a trusted apprentice. They were a source of power and status. A butcher, with a reputation for a particularly good ham or a delicious sausage, could command a higher price for his products, and attract customers from far and wide. His secret recipe was his brand identity, his guarantee of quality. Imagine him now, a silent figure in his workshop, his hands moving with the confidence that only comes from decades of experience. He's not just mixing ingredients, he's performing a kind of alchemy, transforming raw meat into a stable, long-lasting product. The recipe might call for a specific type of salt from a local mine, or a certain herb that grows wild on the hills nearby. These were the ingredients that made his products unique, that gave them a sense of place. This whole process reminds you that in a world without mass production or industrial secrets, the individual was the source of innovation. The medieval butcher was not a cog in a machine, he was the machine itself. His knowledge was his power, and his reputation was his currency. He was a master of a craft that was both a science and a legacy, and his secret recipes were the very heart of that legacy. As you lie there, feeling your eyelids grow heavy, think about the quiet pride of that butcher. The way he would look at his finished products, the way he would sell them with a sense of quiet confidence, knowing that they were not just food, but a piece of his family's history. He was a keeper of secrets, a master of his craft, and a testament to the idea that some of the most valuable knowledge is not found in a book, but in the hands and the heart of a single man. The quiet focus of the butcher's workshop gives way to a more formal and slightly more mysterious atmosphere. The air, which once smelled only of meat and spice, now carries a faint, sharp scent, something clean and chemical. The butcher, your guide, is holding a small pouch of a crystalline white powder. This isn't salt, and it isn't a spice. This is saltpeter, also known as potassium nitrate, and its use in medieval meat preservation was a point of both great effectiveness and great debate. The use of saltpeter in meat curing is a mainstream historical fact, though it was often a closely guarded secret. It was valued for its ability to not only preserve meat, but also to give it that distinctive pinkish red colour we associate with ham and corned beef today. Without saltpeter, cured meat would turn a dull, unappetizing grey or brown. The butcher didn't know the science behind this, but he knew that a ham that was a vibrant pink was much more appealing to his customers than one that was a drab, earthy colour. He knew that the colour signalled freshness and quality, even if the meat was weeks old. The science behind it, which we now understand, is that the nitrates in saltpeter break down into nitrites, which in turn react with the myoglobin in the meat to prevent oxidation and maintain that rich colour. The nitrites also act as a powerful antimicrobial agent, especially against the bacteria that cause botulism, a deadly form of food poisoning. So, the butcher was not just creating a more aesthetically pleasing product, he was making it safer. He was a silent chemist, a practitioner of a science he didn't fully comprehend but that he knew worked. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. Saltpeter was not a common household item. It was often a byproduct of the decomposition of organic matter, a residue found on the walls of caves or cellars, or collected from fertilized soil. The collection of saltpeter was a specialized and often secretive trade. You might find a saltpeter gatherer, a nitroman, scraping the walls of a cellar, a strange and mysterious figure who was a crucial part of the food supply chain. There were even niter beds created by mixing soil, dung, and other organic waste, which were carefully managed to produce the valuable crystals. The fact that a food preservative could be a byproduct of decay and dirt is a fascinating paradox of medieval life. Historians still argue whether the initial use of saltpeter was discovered by accident. Perhaps a butcher noticed that meat cured in a certain soil tasted and looked better, or if it was a deliberate application of chemical knowledge passed down from earlier civilizations. Some scholars believe that the connection between saltpeter and gunpowder, a much more well-known use for the substance, might have led to its use in food, as people would have been familiar with its properties. Others argue that its use was a quiet, empirical discovery that predated its military application. This debate highlights the way that knowledge often spreads between seemingly unrelated fields, from the battlefield to the butcher shop. The controversy around saltpeter wasn't just about its mysterious origins. There was a deeper, more profound debate. Saltpeter was also a component of gunpowder, a tool of war and destruction. Some people believed that using a substance associated with death to preserve food, a source of life, was unnatural or even dangerous. They might have worried about its long-term health effects, even without any scientific basis for their fears. This was a time when superstition and fear were as powerful as reason. The butcher who used saltpeter might have been seen as a kind of alchemist, a man who dabbled in dangerous and unnatural substances. Imagine the butcher now, carefully sprinkling the saltpeter into his brine. He knows what it does. He knows it makes his meat look better and last longer. But he also knows that some of his customers might be suspicious of it. He has to balance his desire for a superior product with the need to maintain the trust of his community. He might keep its use a secret, or he might simply brush off the concerns with a shrug and a knowing look. He is not just a tradesman. He is a manager of perception, a master of a delicate social dance. This whole process reminds you that the medieval butcher was a complex figure, a man who straddled the line between tradition and innovation, between folk knowledge and what we might call a kind of early science. His use of saltpeter was a quiet act of progress, a small step toward a better, safer food supply. It was a testament to his willingness to experiment, to learn, and to use every tool at his disposal to improve his craft. As you lie there, feeling the warmth of your covers, think about that little pouch of white powder. It's not just a preservative, it's a symbol of progress, of controversy, and of the quiet, persistent work of a man who was always looking for a better way. It's a testament to the way that science, even in its most primitive form, was always at work in the real world, in the hands of a man who was just trying to make a living. The sharp, slightly chemical scent of saltpeter fades, replaced by the earthy organic smell of the butcher's more humble and tangible tools. You watch him now, a man of quiet focus, handling a coil of sinew and a length of rope. These aren't just pieces of material, they are the final containers for his preserved masterpieces, the things that will hold his creations together and allow them to be stored and transported. This is the simple but essential art of using casings and ropes. You might think of a sausage casing as a simple tube, a container for ground meat. But in the Middle Ages they were a byproduct of the very animal being butchered, and their preparation was a time-consuming and crucial part of the process. The butcher would meticulously clean the intestines of the animal he had just slaughtered, turning them inside out and scraping them until they were thin and pliable. This was not a glamorous job. It was smelly, messy, and required a certain kind of fortitude. But it was essential. A well-prepared casing was strong, consistent, and would hold the sausage together for months without breaking. A mainstream historical fact is the use of natural casings, which were a zero-waste solution to the problem of a sausage's skin. The intestines, or sometimes the stomach, of a pig or a sheep would be cleaned and used to hold the ground meat. This was not just a clever idea, it was a necessary one. Without a casing, the sausage would have been a loose, unmanageable mess. The casing gave the sausage its shape, protected it from the outside world, and allowed it to be hung for drying, smoking, and curing. It was a perfect example of a system where every single part of the animal had a purpose. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some regions, butchers would use the bladder of an animal to create a large, durable casing for a special kind of sausage. This bladder sausage would be stuffed with a mixture of meat, fat, and spices, and then cured for months, creating a product that was both a delicacy and a conversation piece. The sausage would be so large that it would be a centerpiece at a feast, a testament to the butcher's skill and the wealth of the person who had commissioned it. It's a concept that seems almost bizarre to us today, but it was a perfectly logical and effective use of every single part of the animal. Historians still argue whether the invention of the sausage was primarily a preservation technique, or a way to make use of less desirable cuts of meat. Some scholars believe that the sausage was an innovation born out of a desire to create a long-lasting, portable food source for travellers and armies. Others argue that it was a way for the butcher to use all the scraps and trimmings, the odds and ends of the butchering process that would have otherwise gone to waste. This debate highlights the dual nature of medieval innovation, which was often both practical and resourceful. The ropes were just as important as the casings. A cured sausage or a piece of smoked ham couldn't just be piled up. It had to be hung, and for that the butcher needed strong, durable ropes. These ropes, often made of hemp or other natural fibres, had to be strong enough to bear the weight of a heavy ham for months on end. They had to be tied with specific knots that would hold the meat securely without cutting into it. The ropes, like the casings, were a crucial part of the process. They were the silent, humble infrastructure that held the entire operation together. Imagine the butcher's hands, so skilled with a knife, now expertly tying a series of complex knots. He's not just a butcher, he's a sailor, a rigger, a master of cordage. He's a man who understands the physics of weight and tension. He's a man who knows that one faulty knot could mean a ruined ham, a lost profit and a damaged reputation. His knots, like his recipes, were his own. He had a specific way of doing things that had been passed down from his master, and he would not deviate from it. This process of preparing casings and ropes reminds you that the medieval butcher was a generalist, a jack of all trades. He had to be a master of the animal, but he also had to be a master of the materials that surrounded him. He had to be a man of both blood and bone, and of fibre and knot. He was a man who understood the whole process, from the living animal to the final finished product that would feed a family for a month. As you feel yourself getting drowsier, let your mind drift with the image of that long chain of sausages hanging from the rafters of the butcher's shop. Each one is a small, self-contained world, a testament to the quiet, determined work of a man who understood that even the simplest of materials could be the key to a long-lasting and delicious meal. He was a craftsman, and his tools were not just the sharp things he used to cut, but the humble things he used to hold and to hang. He was a man who saw the purpose in everything, and who wasted nothing. The quiet of the workshop and the stillness of the larder are gone now, replaced by a symphony of sound and a whirlwind of activity. The rhythmic clatter of a handcart on cobblestones, the shouts of vendors, the lowing of animals, the endless murmur of 1,000 voices, this is the sound of market day. You're no longer just a witness, you're in the very heart of the butcher's final act. He is no longer a craftsman in his private world, he's a merchant in a public arena, and the stakes are higher than ever. For all his hard work in curing, smoking and salting, he knows that the race against time is not over, it has only just begun. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval market was the central hub of a community's economic and social life. It was a place of commerce, gossip and public display. For the butcher, it was the final destination for his products, the place where he would either make his living or lose it. The fresh meat he had kept in his larder had to be sold today. He couldn't risk keeping it for another day, not in the open air, not with the constant threat of spoilage. The preserved meat, the hams, the sausages, the dried beef, had a longer shelf life, but even they had to be sold before their quality began to degrade. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some markets, butchers would have a butcher's auction. The freshest cuts would be laid out and sold at the highest price in the morning, and as the day wore on and the sun grew warmer, the prices would drop. By the end of the day, any remaining meat might be sold for a pittance or given away to the poor, a kind of last-ditch effort to not waste what was left. This created a sense of urgency for both the butcher and the customer. You had to get there early to get the best cuts, and you had to be willing to take a risk later in the day if you were on a budget. It was a game of strategy, a balance between demand and the inexorable march of decay. Historians still argue whether the medieval consumer was more concerned with the quality of the meat or the cost. Some scholars believe that in a world with limited resources, price was the most important factor, and people were willing to take a risk on a cheaper, older cut. Others argue that a person's health was paramount, and that a good reputation was more valuable than a low price. This debate highlights the difficult choices that the average person had to make every single day. A bad cut of meat could mean a stomachache, a fever, or worse. So, how much was a day's wages worth to avoid that risk? It's a question that the medieval shopper had to answer every time they went to the market. Imagine the butcher now, standing behind his stall, his hands resting on his counter. He's not just a vendor, he's a showman, a salesman. He knows the provenance of every single piece of meat he has. He can tell a customer which pig it came from, what it ate, how it was cured. He is a living, breathing encyclopedia of his product. He is using his knowledge, his reputation, and his charisma to win over his customers. He's not just selling food, he's selling trust. In a world without consumer protection laws, that trust was everything. The market itself was a sensory overload. The smell of the butcher's stall, with its mix of salted and smoked meats, would be competing with the smells of the baker's stall, the fishmonger's stand, and the tanner's shop. The sounds would be a cacophony of voices, of bartering, of laughter and complaint. The sights would be a riot of colour. The red of a fresh cut of meat, the brown of a smoked sausage, the brilliant colours of fresh vegetables and dyed cloth. It was a vibrant, chaotic and wonderfully alive place. The preserved meat was the butcher's backstop, his guarantee of income even on a bad day. He might not sell all of his fresh meat, but he could almost always sell his cured hams and his salted sausages. These were the long-term investments, the products of his hard work in the autumn that were now paying dividends in the winter and spring. They were the security blanket of his business. He could afford to take a risk on a fresh cut because he knew his long-lasting products would always be in demand. This whole experience reminds you that the medieval butcher was not just a master of his craft, but a master of his business. He had to be a shrewd businessman, a quick thinker, and a good salesman. He had to understand the rhythms of the market, the desires of his customers, and the immense pressure of the ticking clock. He was a man who lived by the motto, sell now or lose it all. As you feel yourself getting drowsy, let the chaotic energy of the market fade into a gentle hum. Think about the butcher standing there, a figure of quiet strength amidst all the noise. He's a man who has mastered his craft, who has navigated the dangerous world of long-distance trade, and who has now come to the final arena to face his customers. He is a master of his domain, and his success is a testament to his skill, his ingenuity, and his quiet determination to provide. He is the last stop on a long, long journey, a journey that started with a living animal and ended with a piece of food that could sustain a family. As the market day winds down and the crowds disperse, your journey takes a turn toward a more exclusive and much more opulent part of the medieval world. You're no longer in the dusty, chaotic heart of the city. You're now in a quiet, manicured space, a world of stone and tapestry, of high walls and manicured gardens. The butcher, your guide, is still here, but he has changed. His clothes are cleaner, his hands are softer, and he moves with an air of quiet confidence that comes from a different kind of patronage. This is the world of the royal butcher, a world of immense privilege and even more immense responsibility. A mainstream historical fact is that a king or a noble's household was a massive self-contained economy. It had to be. Feeding a large castle of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of people was a full-time job. The royal butcher was a crucial part of this. He was not just a tradesman, he was an officer of the household, a man of status and power. He had access to the best resources, the finest animals, the highest quality salt and spices, and a team of apprentices to do the hard, back-breaking work. His job was to ensure a constant supply of the highest quality meat for the royal table, and he had to be a master of every preservation technique we've discussed, and a few more besides. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. A royal butcher's privileges went far beyond just having the best tools and resources. He was often granted a special status, and in some cases, even a title. He might have been a sergeant of the king's buttery, a position that came with land, a small stipend, and the right to carry a sword. He was a man of power, a member of the court, a person who could walk into the presence of the king and not be turned away. This wasn't just about his skill with a knife. It was about the importance of food in a world where a famine could bring down a kingdom. Historians still argue whether the royal butcher's innovations in preservation were driven by a desire for a more refined culinary experience or simply a matter of scale. Some scholars believe that the noble's palate demanded a more subtle flavour, and that the royal butcher would experiment with techniques like honey curing or delicate smoking to create a superior product. Others argue that his primary job was to simply produce a massive quantity of long-lasting food, and that his innovations were a result of needing to feed a small army of people on a daily basis. This debate highlights the two sides of a coin, the desire for luxury versus the simple need for survival, and how they both influenced innovation. Imagine the royal butcher now, in his clean, well-lit workshop, with its stone floors and iron hooks. He's working with a different kind of animal, not the scrawny field-raised pigs of the village, but a specially bred hog fattened on grain and acorns. The meat is of a superior quality, and his job is to make it last. He would have a staff to help him with the mundane tasks, the salting, the cleaning, the hoisting of the meat. He was a manager, an overseer, a leader. He was a man who knew how to delegate and how to create a system that worked flawlessly, day in and day out. The access to resources was a game changer. The royal butcher didn't have to worry about the cost of salt or the availability of spices. They were his for the asking. He could experiment with different types of wood for smoking, different blends of herbs for his rubs. He could afford to fail, to throw away a batch of bad meat, which was a luxury the village butcher could never have. This freedom to experiment and to innovate meant that the royal butcher was often on the cutting edge of food preservation. He was the one who was pushing the boundaries, who was perfecting the art. The royal table, you see, was a kind of living menu of all the different methods of preservation. There would be fresh meat from the larder, roasted and served for a feast. There would be a heavily salted ham, a staple for a winter meal. There would be a smoked sausage, a portable food for a journey, and there would be a honey-cured venison, a delicacy for a special guest. The royal butcher was a living, breathing encyclopedia of all the different ways to keep meat from spoiling. This whole experience reminds you that even in a world where survival was a daily struggle, there were still levels of luxury and privilege. The medieval butcher was not a single monolithic figure. He was a man of many different stations, from the humble village tradesman to the powerful royal officer. His skill, his ingenuity, and his access to resources all defined his place in the world. He was a crucial link in the food chain, and his work was valued no matter what his social status. As you feel yourself getting drowsy, let your mind drift with the image of that quiet, clean royal workshop, the smell of rich, cured meat, the quiet order of things, the sense of immense responsibility and immense privilege. It's a world that is both a part of and a world away from the village butcher we met at the beginning of our journey. It's a testament to the idea that a single craft can exist on 1,000 different levels, from the most humble to the most powerful. He was a master of his craft, and his legacy is a world where we can take for granted the safety and deliciousness of our food. The opulent world of the royal court fades, and you are back in the heart of the city, but it's a different city now. It is more organised, more formal, and more structured. The individual butcher, the lone master of his craft, is no longer alone. He is now part of something larger, something more powerful, a guild. You can feel the quiet authority of this new order in the way he carries himself, in the way his shop is set up, in the new standardised tools he uses. This is a story of community, of regulation, and of the formalisation of a trade. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval period saw the rise of powerful guilds, which were associations of craftsmen or merchants who controlled the practice of their craft in a town or city. The Butchers' Guild was a particularly powerful and important one. It was a kind of union, a regulatory body, and a social club all rolled into one. The guild set the standards for quality, the prices, and the rules for who could and could not practice the trade. If you wanted to be a butcher, you had to be a member of the guild, and to become a member, you had to go through a long and arduous apprenticeship. The guild's primary function was to protect its members and to ensure the quality of their products. They would have inspectors who would check the meat at the market, making sure it was not spoiled and that it had been properly preserved. They would also set the rules for how the meat was to be processed, which animals could be slaughtered, and how they were to be sold. This was a massive step toward a more reliable food supply. The customer no longer had to rely on a single butcher's reputation. They could rely on the reputation of the entire guild. It was a brand, a seal of approval, a guarantee of quality. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The guilds were not just about business. They were also about social life and community. They would have their own feast days, their own patron saint, and their own rituals. A new apprentice might have to go through a long and difficult initiation ceremony to become a journeyman, and a journeyman might have to create a masterpiece of butchery, a particularly complex or difficult cut of meat, a perfectly cured ham, a new type of sausage, to become a master. The guild was a kind of extended family, a brotherhood of shared knowledge and shared experience. It was a place where a butcher could find support, a community, and a sense of belonging. Historians still argue whether the guilds were a force for good or a force for oppression. Some scholars believe that the guilds protected consumers and ensured quality, and that they gave the craftsmen a sense of dignity and security. Others argue that the guilds were a kind of monopoly, that they stifled innovation by preventing outsiders from entering the trade, and that they kept prices artificially high. This debate highlights the complex and often contradictory nature of medieval social structures. The guilds were both a source of stability and a source of stagnation. Imagine the butcher now, no longer a solitary figure but a member of a powerful organisation. He has a rule book he must follow, a set of standards he must uphold. He's part of a system that is both a comfort and a constraint. He knows that if he does good work he will be protected by his guild. He knows that if he does bad work he will be disciplined. It's a trade-off. He gives up some of his freedom in exchange for security and reputation. The standardization that the guilds brought about had a direct effect on meat preservation. The recipes for brines and cures, which were once family secrets, now had to be shared and codified. The methods for smoking and drying, which were once intuitive, now had to be taught to apprentices in a formal, standardized way. This meant that the quality of preserved meat improved across the board. You could buy a ham in one town and know that it was cured in much the same way as a ham in another town. It was the beginning of a kind of quality control, a precursor to the modern food safety standards we have today. The butcher's tools were also standardized. The guilds would have specific requirements for the size and shape of a knife, the weight of a cleaver, the type of hook that could be used. This meant that an apprentice could learn to use a tool in one workshop and know that it would be the same in another. It was the beginning of a kind of professionalism, a move away from the ad hoc, individualistic nature of the early Middle Ages toward a more formal, structured world. This whole experience reminds you that the medieval butcher was not just a craftsman. He was a key part of a social and economic revolution. The rise of the guilds was a massive step toward a more organised, more stable, and more reliable world. The butcher's role in this was central. His craft, once a quiet private art, was now a public regulated science. As you feel yourself getting drowsy, let the quiet order of the guild hall wash over you. Think about the butcher, sitting in a meeting with his peers, debating the rules, sharing his knowledge, and defending his craft. He's no longer just a man with a knife. He's a member of a community, a guardian of a tradition, and a key player in the creation of a more reliable and more secure world. He is a testament to the idea that a single craft can be the foundation of an entire social structure. The quiet order of the guild hall dissolves, and a new, much darker reality presses in. The air is no longer filled with the reassuring smells of salt and smoke, but with a rank, sour odour, a scent that speaks of failure and danger. You're no longer watching the butcher succeed. You are witnessing what happens when his ancient art fails. This is the grim and undeniable consequence of spoiled meat, a silent threat that hung over every meal, every day of the medieval world. It is the reason all the work we've explored was so desperately important. A mainstream historical fact is that foodborne illnesses were a constant and deadly threat. Without modern refrigeration, food safety standards, and a scientific understanding of bacteria, a bad cut of meat could be a death sentence. The most common illnesses, caused by bacteria like Salmonella and E. coli, would have resulted in severe cramps, diarrhea, and fever. In a world with no antibiotics and limited medical knowledge, these symptoms could quickly lead to dehydration and death. The very real risk of food poisoning was the most powerful motivator for every single preservation technique we've discussed. It was the why behind the how. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some cases, spoiled meat was not just a source of illness, but a form of public shaming. A butcher who was caught selling bad meat might be put in the stocks, or even forced to eat some of the spoiled meat himself. The community was not just a customer, it was a jury. A butcher who betrayed the trust of his customers by selling them something that could harm them would face a swift and brutal punishment. The guilds in particular were very strict about this. A member who sold bad meat could be fined, expelled, or worse. The reputation of the entire guild was at stake, and they would not tolerate a single bad apple. This shows just how seriously people took the threat of spoiled food. Historians still argue whether food poisoning was more prevalent in the cities, where meat had to be transported over long distances and sold in crowded markets, or in the countryside, where a single bad harvest could lead to widespread malnutrition and a reliance on poorly preserved food. Some scholars believe that the close quarters and ad hoc nature of city life made it a hotbed for disease. Others argue that the poverty and lack of resources in rural areas made them more vulnerable. This debate highlights the different challenges faced by urban and rural populations and reminds us that there was no safe place in the Middle Ages. Imagine the consumer now, a peasant or a commoner, looking at a piece of meat on a market stall. They don't have a thermometer or a sell-by date. They have to rely on their senses, the smell, the colour, the feel. They have to trust the butcher. But what if their senses fail them? What if the butcher is a fraud? A stomachache that we might write off today could have been the start of a long painful illness. A fever that we might treat with a pill could have been a sign that the body was fighting a losing battle. The quiet, insidious work of the bacteria was the butcher's true enemy, and in a world without science it was a battle that was often lost. The consequences weren't just personal. A sickness that started with one person could quickly spread through an entire village or a city. A foodborne illness could become an epidemic, a silent killer that moved from family to family, taking the young and the old. The village butcher was not just a man who sold food. He was a man who held the health of his community in his hands. His success or failure was a matter of life and death. This whole process reminds you that the medieval world was a place of immense risk. Every meal was a roll of the dice. Every decision, from what to eat to where to buy it, was a choice between survival and sickness. The butcher was a kind of high priest in this dangerous religion of food. He was the one who was supposed to keep you safe, to protect you from the invisible dangers that lurked in every piece of flesh. As you feel yourself getting drowsy, let the grim reality of this side of the story wash over you. Think about the quiet desperation of a mother trying to feed her children with a piece of meat that might be bad. Think about the butcher, his face grim as he throws a spoiled piece of meat into a fire. He knows. He knows what could have happened. He knows that his job is not just to sell, but to protect. He is a guardian, a sentinel against the unseen forces of decay. He is a man who holds the very lives of his customers in his hands. The dark spectre of spoiled meat and its grim consequences now recedes. As you awaken from your medieval dream, the air around you is no longer thick with the smells of salt and smoke, but with the sterile, clean scent of a modern world. Yet, as you look around, you realise that the butcher, your silent guide, is still here, and his legacy is everywhere. The quiet, determined work of a man fighting decay in a world without refrigeration did not die with him. It simply evolved. The enduring legacy of medieval butchers' preservation techniques is a mainstream historical fact that you can see every day in your own refrigerator and on your own dinner plate. The heavily salted hams of the Middle Ages are still with us, albeit in a more refined form. The smoked sausage that fed a family through a long winter is now a deli staple. The air-dried beef that was a portable food for travellers is now a gourmet delicacy you can find in any specialty food store. The principles of moisture removal, pH control, and antimicrobial action are the same. We just have a better understanding of the science behind them. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, consider the etymology of the word sausage. It comes from the Latin word salsus, meaning salted. This is a direct nod to the primary role of salt in the preservation process, a legacy that is literally embedded in the language we use every day. The word itself is a quiet reminder of a world where salt was not just a seasoning, but a life-saving tool. It's a bit of linguistic archaeology that connects us directly to the past. Historians still argue whether the invention of modern refrigeration was a sudden, revolutionary breakthrough or a slow, inevitable progression from the techniques of the past. Some scholars argue that the invention of the mechanical refrigerator was a complete game-changer, a technology that made all the old preservation methods obsolete. Others argue that the medieval techniques of salting, smoking and curing laid the intellectual groundwork for our modern food safety standards. This debate highlights a larger theme in history. Is progress a series of leaps or a continuous, slow-moving river? The truth, as usual, is probably a mix of both. The medieval butcher's art was a slow river that flowed for centuries, and our modern technology is the rapids that came after. Think about the way we still preserve food today. We use salt in curing hams and bacon. We smoke fish and meat. We dry cure salami and prosciutto. We ferment sauerkraut and kimchi. These are not new inventions, they are refinements of ancient techniques. We just do them with more precision, with more science, and with a lot more electricity. The modern butcher, with his refrigerated display case and his vacuum-sealed bags, is a direct descendant of the medieval butcher, with his salt barrel and his smokehouse. He is a man who is standing on the shoulders of giants. The legacy also extends to our modern food safety standards. The medieval butcher's hard-won knowledge of the importance of cleanliness, of not letting fresh meat sit out for too long, of keeping things cool, is the very foundation of our modern food safety regulations. We have just codified it, quantified it, and made it a matter of law. The quiet, vigilant work of a single man in a small shop is now a multi-billion-dollar industry with government agencies and international standards. And what about the taste? The unique, rich and complex flavours of things like prosciutto and smoked ham are not just a result of modern technology. They are a direct result of the ancient preservation methods. The salt, the smoke, the lactic acid from fermentation. These are the things that give these foods their unique character. We don't eat them just because they are safe. We eat them because they are delicious. The flavour of the medieval past is still with us, a quiet reminder of a time when food was not just a source of sustenance, but a work of art. So, as you lie there, in your comfortable, climate-controlled home, let your mind reflect on this long, long journey. From the salt barrel to the refrigerator, from the smokehouse to the stainless steel smoker, from the village butcher to the global food corporation, the story of how we keep meat from rotting is a story of human ingenuity, of quiet determination, and of the enduring legacy of a single craft. The medieval butcher was not a man of the past. He was a pioneer of the future. The journey is at its end. The story has been told. It's time now to let your own thoughts slow, to soften the edges of the day's worries. The old smells, the cold, the hunger, they're all just echoes now, quiet whispers from a time long ago. Fade the final imagery of the butcher's calm face in the firelight, the smell of wood smoke and salt, and the gentle rhythm of the work. Let the memory of his quiet strength and his endless patience carry you into a peaceful slumber. The world is safe and the food is sound.